Hi there, I'm Ryan Quintel and welcome to Sketch for Adobe Switchers. This is a multi-part video series where I'm going to introduce you to the program Sketch for interface and experience design and also leverage your working knowledge of the Adobe suite and software like Photoshop and Illustrator so that you have a leg up and understand a little bit better what's happening. In these videos, I'm going to be using macOS Mojave as my demo environment, but many of the things we'll learn here will be applicable to Sketch for years to come, and some of which will be retroactively applied to an older version of Sketch. Sketch is updated all the time, so maybe some details you're going to see here could be different or have changed. But if these tutorials get a great response, I will surely update them for whatever major milestones and changes come along. I'm going to start today by launching Sketch and getting right into things. I'll use Command Space and use Spotlight to launch it. That's what I like to do. And when you start Sketch, you kind of have this option on this beginning screen where you can learn a bunch of things. Maybe you're learning with this video instead of one of Sketch's resources. But you have the option to toggle between your recent projects and templates. Templates are basically what you would just get in an Adobe start screen these days. So preset sizes, preset canvases for you to already have things a little quicker started for you. But I'm going to start with just a new document. And now I can either hit choose or enter on my keyboard. So this is the basic Sketch interface. There might be some tools here that look familiar to you, and there might be some that look a little strange and different. We're going to go over these one at a time, but first we're going to talk about this big white square area in between, or maybe it's dark if you're using dark mode. It's the canvas. So this is the same as you would get in Photoshop or Illustrator. It's just raw space that you can draw on or start designing in right away. But Sketch is really at home when you're using artboards. Just like Photoshop had updated a few years ago, artboards are kind of at the core of designing in Sketch. So there's a couple ways to add artboards. First is the Insert menu. So I can come up here to Insert, and you can see there's a bunch of different options. There's a lot of things you can insert into a Sketch document. And Sketch is really good at showing you right within its menus what your sort of keyboard shortcuts are. I think as we go through these lessons, one of the largest changes you're going to have to get used to is keyboard shortcuts. They're kind of different in Sketch, and in a way, they're, I think, a little easier to remember and understand. So here I can click on Artboard, or I can press A on my keyboard. First, I'll click. So before we place the artboard, and I could just drag and outline my own size, here we have a list of preset sizes. So maybe you want to design something for phones or iPad. These are all Apple devices, but you can come and change the category. Responsive web. I love desktop HD. That's kind of a great size for me to work in when I'm doing web stuff. So I'm going to go ahead and pick that. So now you can see the artboard's a little bit bigger. So I'll just zoom out and pinch with my trackpad here. And you see here this artboard is titled Desktop HD, so it has the title of whatever the preset is. It's also the same up here, and we can talk a little bit about what this does in a second. So the artboard itself has a pixel count. You can see here in our rulers this blue, starting at 0 pixels all the way to 1440, which is the exact width and height of our artboard. Now, if we want to, we can kind of use this control over here to toggle the aspect ratios. Maybe we're dealing with tall or wide. And I like to make, if you're doing print work, and you can absolutely do print work in Sketch, you can make paper sizes and stuff as your preset. If you know the pixel count, just take the number of inches and multiply it by 72, and that's 72 pixels per inch of paper, and you can export from there. But this is an artboard, and this is kind of the basics of Sketch. So we can start working on this one artboard, but maybe we're going to need a bunch of them. So I'm going to hit A instead of going into the menu, and I'm going to pick another one. You can see artboards kind of cascade to the right of each other. I'll hit A, and I'll add another one. So here we have 3 artboards. Now, whether you're zoomed out or zoomed in, you notice the name of the artboard stays relatively the same size on screen. So maybe like 11 or 12 pixels and small type there. If you ever want to grab an artboard, you can just grab it by its name and start aligning things. And you can see, like you would get in Illustrator or Photoshop, you kind of have some smart guides that will guide you and start telling you how many pixels these things are away. If you start putting artboards in random places, and some people are one to do that, I'm not. When you go to make a new artboard, it's going to do its best to add it to the end of your previously selected artboard. So that's kind of how this organization works. You can see here that they end in the order that you place them on top of each other in the layers panel. Speaking of layers, this is the layers panel. Now I know it's a little hard to see because we don't have any layers yet, so I'm going to quickly skip ahead and just make a couple objects here so we can see what layers look like inside of Sketch. So here, very similar to Photoshop or Illustrator, granted it's on the left, but you have layers here. And layers are essentially named like objects. This is much closer to how Illustrator handles layering. And layers can be moved and rearranged. You can also double-click them and rename them. You can also hide layers by using this little handy eyeball. Or you can lock layers. If you right-click a layer, you can lock it. Or my favorite, I kind of hold down Option, and instead of getting hide, I get lock. So that's a good way to kind of show, hide, and start managing your layers. And of course, you can direct select these from the canvas. So I am in Photoshop, an auto select person. I know people are either auto select people or they're not, but I am. So I'm right at home by clicking things directly on the canvas and moving them around. You can right click any layer and have access to the same controls that you do in the layers palette. But you can also use keyboard shortcuts like you have in Adobe to rearrange these layers. They're a little different though. So here I'm going to hold down Command and Option. And you'll see here that the kind of red highlights change. So that's also a good way to peek at like a position of a layer. I'm going to hold down Command and Option and use up and down on my keyboard. So you see as I press these things, rectangle is moving above and below the renamed layer. Well, similar to Adobe, but still using our Command and Option together, I'll use Command, Option, and Control, so kind of 3 fingers right next to each other, and holding down all those 3, when you press up and down, it's forward and back. So the very top and the very bottom of the layers stack. So again, just Command and Option, up and down, moving a layer around, add Control, and then you're going top to bottom. And you'll find that Command and Option and Control are definitely a little bit more of a Sketch paradigm than they are the Adobe paradigm. So that's a little difference there for you. Now, just like with Adobe, you can group layers. And that's as simple as selecting the layers that you want to group. So here we have 2. I locked this circle. I'm going to unlock it for posterity. Selecting 3 layers, and you can either right-click and say Group Selection, or I like the old Adobe shortcut Command-G, and that simply creates a group, and groups look like folders inside of the Sketch Layers palette. You can name your group. Name Goop, that's no good. Name your group, and of course you can show, hide, and lock groups. Now we're getting to a little quirk of groups, and this is an important thing to know. So groups move around all together, they scale, and they rotate together. But what's a little bit different is if you have auto select on if something's in a group in, say, Photoshop, you can just click it and a group will expand and you'll have access to it. Doesn't work quite like that in Sketch. Instead, you have a little bit more like how Illustrator handles things, where you double click in and now you can see the group expands and I have access to the objects. Now, if you prefer that not to happen, you can go ahead and set Select Group Content on Click. Now, there's a lot of stuff over here on the right, and it can be overwhelming. We will get to it, trust me. But if I check off Select Group Content on Click, then these things behave as they would, and you can see the Layers panel. Things are just being grabbed and moved around. So, no big deal. If you ever want to get back, you can select the group itself in the Layers panel and uncheck that. Now, as a little tip and trick, if you prefer always one way over the other, you can hit Command comma on your keyboard to get to Preferences, or use the Mac menu bar to go to Sketch and Preferences, and go over to Layers section here, and you can say, every time I create a group, I always want to select the contents in it. I prefer to use it the default way, and I'm going to continue with this unselected, but if you really like that direct selection feeling inside of Sketch like you would get in a Photoshop, well, this could be the option for you. For now, I'm going to close that and go a little bit back to our group. The next thing I want to talk about as a Sketch basic is the concept of pages. Now, this is a little bit different than you get in most Photoshop or Illustrator ways of thinking. A page is simply a group of artboards. So we have all these artboards. Say this is one entire section of a website, or this is one potential version of a website that you're showing a client. And I'm just going to organize these so they look a little bit better. Well, this over here in our Pages section, and that's in the top right, it could be collapsed by default for you and look a little bit more like this. But this is page 1. And it shows you that all of your artboards are associated with page 1. Well, if you hit this Add New button here, then you get page 2. And page 2 is just a whole new section where I'm going to tap A and create some more artboards. And you can see when you tap A and create an artboard, the Layers panel automatically goes into naming mode. So I'll just call this Ryan. We'll call that Student. So you can see here, it's a really quick way of getting around. But these are associated with page 2. Now you can toggle back, as this is a drop down, but I like to keep it expanded here and just give me very direct control. I accidentally named page 2 A. I guess I was a little overzealous in my clicking around. But there's page 1 and there's page 2. These are two separate things, but keep in mind, if you start adding a ton of artboards and a ton of pages, you're going to get a big, maybe slightly unmanageable sketch file. That's not to say it's a bad thing. It's probably still going to clock in smaller than your typical Photoshop file and maybe around the size of your Illustrator files. But page 1 and page 2, just a bunch of artboards together. And if you like what you have and you want to kind of version it off, you can always right-click and duplicate or delete pages. So now I have this preserved. Let's say this was a magical, special, modern art piece. And I want to keep working, but preserve that state. Well, Pages is a nice way of doing that. Of course, since it's a native Mac app, you have options to time machine and restoring and all that kind of fun stuff. But we're not going to get into that today. We're going to just focus on the basics. Now, we have a couple extra things to talk about before we get out of here. And the first is properties. Earlier, when I started selecting things like groups and objects, we saw that the panel over here on the right can change drastically. Depending on what is selected, some things exist or don't exist. In more recent copies of Adobe software, you do have a ever-changing properties panel, but Sketch has kind of had this since the beginning, and it's how they express most of the options for something all within one place. So the way to read these is first you have your coordinates, which is where something is located inside of an artboard. Over here we see degrees. That's your rotation. Here I'm going to change it to 45 and you'll see the change. Now with all of these things, you'll notice that you have up and down arrows. If you're very finicky, you can come and use these and barely adjust. This is the same as using your arrow keys though, so I don't mess with that very much. And then you have width and height and a couple options here as well. So you can lock these so they stay always in proportion. And when you go to size them up, then you get these increasingly large numbers, but in proportion, which is nice. And of course, you can unlock and just change these numbers by themselves, and you can see this square getting thinner. I'm going to just clean things up a little bit. And I'm just tapping on those layers and hitting delete, so it's a little bit clearer what's going to go on. Now, another detail of the properties panel is that these fields accept math. So if you want something, say, 24 pixels bigger, I'll say plus 24, and I'll get 24 more pixels of width. That means you could say cut it in half, divide by 2, and I can say plus 10%. And that plus 10% increases the width of this object by 10% of the artboard or the canvas width. It's a little finicky and it's a lot to keep in your head, but once you master this, it's going to be very, very powerful. It's a good, quick way of saying, guess what? I want this 90% wide. I want this 50% tall. And then you have a perfectly 90-50 square slash rectangle on your canvas. We're going to talk about in later lessons resizing, prototyping, appearance, style, all this good stuff. But the properties panel is what's going to get you most of the way there. So if you're ever in doubt or you're not sure why you can't change something or where an option might be, I think the first thing to do is start perusing this menu. And it always stays the same up here at the top, which is nice. But peruse this menu, and if you're not finding the option here, then maybe start searching the system menus or something. But as you're poking around, the properties panel will be very important to you. Finally, last but not least, is just a couple view options, because I know everybody is different here. So let's look at some of the view options. So I'm going to come up to this view menu, and you can see here, show slices and prototype. There's a couple things on by default. I am viewing rulers. I'm going to turn that off. The ruler's not so important to me, and it gives me a little bit more space to work with. You can show pixels. So I'm going to make an oval for a second so we can really look in here. It's very similar to Illustrator that we're doing vector-based editing, but it could be you're working on an icon or something. Well, you can show pixels, and then you'll get an accurate representation of what that thing will look like on your screen. We also have show grid, which is something that we can define, and show layout, which is a way to give us columns. And if you really want to get into this, and we're not going to spend much time in these lessons about grids and columns, but you can go into grid settings and layout settings and mess with those to your heart's content, and things are just right for your project. So you made it. That is the basics. I know it's a lot, and you might find yourself re-watching this video to catch some of the details in it. But our next video is going to be But now that we kind of know our way around with our toolbar at the top, properties on the right, layers and pages on the left, and the canvas and artboards in the center, we can begin using Sketch to create our prototypes slash interfaces slash wireframes or whatever you're trying to accomplish. Now, the next video to check out is the basics of creation and editing, but if you want, I'm also going to make a little tips and tricks video where I'll show you some keyboard shortcuts for getting around quickly, and we're going to get into kind of customizing our interface to suit what we like to see. I'll see you in the next lesson.